Hello students. So in this lecture we'll be discussing about or learning about the play within the play that we find in the text of Hamlet, and what are its implications. So the play within the play that I'm talking about is something that is known as metatheater. I am guessing, or I'm hoping that you have at least heard of the term. Metatheater is nothing but multiple theatrics, or theater within the theater, or to put it very plainly, the play within a play. Now it has certain implications and significations. So apart from the very apparent significance of the mousetrap, that is the play which is enacted within the play of Hamlet, the mousetrap which the tragedians perform, with which Hamlet thinks or says that the play is the thing to catch the conscience of the king. So Hamlet apparently thinks that Hamlet thinks that the play would be instrumental in bringing out the guilt of Claudius, to which he is certainly successful to some extent. However, we will be discussing about how successful, or whether or not that is true at all, whether or not Claudius is actually affected by the play so much so that he is moved by it, moved to show his guilt. So in order to understand the metatheatrics, or the importance or the significance of that particular play within the play, the mousetrap, we need to go back to our classical studies, or the influences on Shakespeare, or the Renaissance context of the Elizabethan era, or the preceding times of England, influences of, or how should I put it, not certainly influences, but yes, Shakespeare was growing up in an era wherein these philosophies or these theories did exist, about dramatic tragedies, about drama, about plays, about art. So let's see what it is all about. Now, metatheatricality is a typical feature of revenge tragedy. Right? Now these scenes, wherever we find a play within a play, certainly we find them in A Midsummer Night's Dream, we find in Hamlet, of course. So these scenes do very little to push or propel the action of the plot. Instead, they explore the way different spectators or the audience react to dramatic fictions, how people react to the drama that is being enacted on the stage. And thus they comment on the interplay between tragic action and audience response. In a way, the play is as much about us as it is about Hamlet, that is, the mousetrap, if I'm talking about particularly. The mousetrap is as much a play which is about us as it is about Hamlet the character. So in 1612, that is also the time of Shakespeare, when Thomas Heywood writes in Apology for Actors, or proposes a theory, he presents a series of arguments ranging from the respective tradition of the theatre, reaching back into antiquity, to the indispensable or to the very important role of acting or performances in the study of rhetoric, which he claimed very much in lines that echo Hamlet as well. He claimed that the theatrical tradition and acting, the antiquities, they teach a student to fit his phrases to his action, and his action to his phrase, and his pronunciation to them both. So you can see that these lines very much echo Hamlet's own speech. When he says that he should have the action, he should be able to act out his thoughts. So Heywood also presents this particular idea that the indispensable role of acting in the study of rhetoric teaches a student to fit his phrases to his action and his action to his phrase, and his pronunciation to them both. The theatre is an ornament to London and a magnet for foreign visitors. It still is. Haywood asserts in his book, Apology for Actors. And the theatre industry has led to a marked refinement in the English language, he says. Plays inspire us to virtue by presenting role models and arouse us to reject vice, that is evil. This exalted mission, this mission of creating role models that would push us to virtue, that would inspire us to virtue, and also arouse our reaction of negativity, or the fact that we should reject vice or evil. This mission is fulfilled by tragedy. And as Haywood puts it, he says that if we present a tragedy, we include the fatal and abortive ends of such as commit notorious murders, which is aggravated and acted with all the art that may be, to terrify men from the like abhorred practices. So that is like the actors who commit these notorious murders, so that we may be moved by them and we may remove ourselves from these abhorred or from these hated practices, from these hated deeds, that is. The theatre, Haywood concludes or opines about, is an establishment for the reform of the erring humankind, human beings who commit errors. The theatre, Haywood says that human beings who commit errors, they are reformed by the establishment of the theatre. He writes what can sooner print modesty in the souls of the wanton than by discovering unto them the monstrousness of their sin. So simply put, he says that we can sooner, or human beings, in the souls of human beings, there can be sooner put the seed of modesty if they witness or if they discover the monstrousness of their sin. Now, if you remember, Hamlet also has the same idea. He says that I've heard that guilty creatures sitting at a play have by the very cunning of the scene been struck so to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefactions. And says again, he determines to use the play to catch the conscience of the king. Now all of the positive effects of theatre can be outbalanced by all of the negative impressions or the negative theories or the negative philosophies that exist against theatre. And we can go back to Plato regarding this, as he refers to the old quarrel between philosophy and poetry. It's centuries old. This controversy took a different shape in different periods, but central to this dispute or conflict was the role that dramatic arts played in stimulating the passions. Dramatic art stimulates your passions. The question of Plato's aesthetics, or what Plato proposes in his book, he writes about it in Ion, in Phaedru. The question that he poses is complex, but very simply put, his theory of art is grounded on the notion that all representation or mimesis, that is thrice removed from the truth. Thrice removed from the truth, which is only accessible in the realm of ideal forms. Now, what he writes is this. He says that while a craftsman attempts to create an ideal in his work, the representation of an artifact is always only the imitation of an imitation. Now I've explained it on the screen, so I suggest that you read through it. It's quite easy and not very difficult to understand. But Plato singles out dramatic poetry for all of these charges. Because according to him, dramatic poetry has deeply corrupting influence on human nature. Because it creates seductive illusions. Drama gratifies our lower nature, he says, and encourages us to give free rein to the emotions instead of attempting to master them or to balance them, to create a balance in our passions, in our emotions. Even those of us who attempt to employ restraint in our private griefs give way to an outpouring of feeling when we watch the tragic fate of fictive creators. Now we can see that why Aristotle would come and say something that is very much akin to this Plato's idea, yet completely alters Plato's conclusion. So we'll come to that. So he says that even those of us who attempt to employ restraint in our private griefs give way to an outpouring of feeling when we watch the tragic fate of these fictive characters. What we do not realize is that the emotion for others we indulge in, that is the emotion of the characters or the actors, it seeps into, it slowly accumulates in our own life. By indulging in the illusory sorrows that we see on stage, we lower our threshold of self-control, and we are susceptible to similar dangers, to similar outbursts of passion in our own lives. Acting itself is a perilous, dangerous undertaking, he says, and can infect one with the traits one is impersonating. So the actor itself can be impregnated by the traits of the character that he is acting out. And Aristotle comes and connects emotions to judgment and belief. Our emotional response, he says, is based on the evaluation of a situation, that we evaluate that we have a situation at hand, we evaluate it, and according to that our emotional response is based. And how we evaluate or how we handle the situation or how we judge the situation is partly shaped by our beliefs, by the beliefs in our life. Right? I believe in something, and that is why I have a perspective and according to which I judge a situation and react to it. Since beliefs are responsive to reason and they can be changed, they are not permanent, emotions can also be manipulated, emotions can also be steered by means of education. Here is where Aristotle completely differs from Plato. He says that education can be used to steer our emotional responses. Aristotle affirms that self-control was not an adequate condition for ethical behavior. So according to Plato, dramatic art, it reduces your self-control. But Aristotle says that having self-control is not merely enough for an ethical behavior. Emotions are also instrumental. Emotions also have a role to play in inspiring us to live a virtuous life. For Aristotle, emotions are bound up in social interaction, in the social life, and they are not just impulsive, they are not merely irrational or irrational impulse. We can also put it like that. Aristotle did not only demonstrate that emotions were an intelligent form of behavior, but they were also indispensable for virtue. So emotion and reason, something that we are very quick to separate in our practical lives, they are not really separate from each other. They support each other, they complement and supplement each other. They form an estranged relationship, kind of. They may seem to be apart from each other, but they are in reality not. He goes on to say then in his Poetics, tragedy then is mimesis of an action which is elevated, complete, and of magnitude, in language embellished by distinct forms in its sections, employing the mode of enactment, etc., etc. Aristotle basically says that tragic drama has a therapeutic effect and it cleanses us of excessive emotion. Instead of stimulating passions, it cleanses us of our excessive emotions. Mimesis, Aristotle declares, is a part of what makes us human. Human beings are the most imitative creatures in the world, and this I think all of us would agree. We learn through imitating others and we delight in images. We are, after all, telocentric. We believe in what we see. We learn through imitating others, we delight in images. His answer to the very naughty, that is Knowty, naughty question as to why we take pleasure in painful sights is to point to the instructive value that these images provide. Painful sights, they provide instructive values. And therefore, in the most important work of literary criticism to appear in England during the early modern period, that was Sir Philip Sidney's A Defence of Poetry, he offers a summation of most of these ideas that were present during the time. That is, poesy, therefore, is an art of imitation. That is to say, a representation, counterfeiting, or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. But when we come to the play within the play of Hamlet, or when the player gives the speech relating to Hecuba, after which Hamlet's one of his famous soliloquies comes, oh what a rogue and peasant slave am I, we don't see that after the player's speech is finished, we don't find any of the characters in the play, or anyone for the matter, who is moved by the show, apart from the actor who plays. Now the acting or the performance was based on the Aeneid, right? The Aeneid itself goes on to recount how at the gruesome murder of Priam, Aeneas is reminded of his own father. Catching a glimpse of Helen, he is briefly overcome by a surge of vengeful passion directed at a woman he blames for the catastrophe that has befallen Troy. Similar with Hamlet, of course. Parallels to Hamlet's own stories abound. We can find numerous parallels over here. But these do not seem to have crossed his mind, crossed Hamlet's mind. Hamlet does not find any attunement or any similarity between the Aeneid story and his own. The play might have activated an array, the play that is The Mousetrap, it might have activated an array of responses on his part too, either creating a wave of pity for an old man and his wife facing a pitiless murderer, or anger at the assassination of a king, or identification with the avenging hero, be it Pyrrhus or Aeneas, or guilt at the heroic pity that we find in the play of Aeneid. At the least, it is surprising that he does not pounce upon the sorrow of a queen at the assassination of her husband. Hamlet does not do anything after watching the play. He is quite passive. He is not moved to any sort of pity, or he is not moved to any sort of his passions are not stimulated, his passions are not regenerated. He is not moved to pity, he is not moved to anger. However, Rodri Lewis argues in her reading of Hamlet, argues that Hamlet is unable to respond to the events depicted in the player's speech with either pity or avenging fury, because in reality he feels little of either emotion in relation to his dead father. And this is an eye-opener. He is not moved to pity or anger because he does not have any of these feelings associated with his dead father. His fetishizing of the actor, his obsession over the actor who plays, his fetishizing of the actor instead of the play is an evasive tactic. It is an escapist strategy. It is an escapist strategy that actually conceals or covers up his emptiness inside. The fact that he feels nothing. It covers up his evasive tactic, his reaction to the play actually covers up his emptiness inside. Now, this is one reading that is provided by Rodri Lewis. But once Hamlet is alone, he vents his resentment and envy of the actor, whose grief and anger at the fate of a mythological character appear more authentic than does his own reaction to his father's murder. And therefore we have this line. Hamlet is referring he's referring to the early modern theory of acting, which was closely linked to the art of oration or oratory. They were both grounded in the classical physiological doctrines about the passions. We are well aware of classical humorism, where passions have been attributed to the balance of humors in the body. Excessive humors such as choler or black bile bred the emotions of anger or melancholy respectively. No less familiar than this is to us the thought that passions affected the humors also. Like, it is not only the humors which affect the passion, but it is also the other way around. Central to this concept was again Aristotle's articulated ideas in De Anima, where he says that the soul never thinks without a mental image. What we perceive through the senses influences our emotional response, but so do the images in our mind. So our perception is based, our emotional response is based on our sensory perceptions, what we see, what we hear, what we touch, what we speak, but also the images that are existent in our mind. They may be imagined objects, or they may also be memories. The actor was able to exert control over his humors and their bodily articulation simply by conjuring up an appropriate image in their mind, conjuring up an appropriate mental image, that is. This would activate the passions the character he was playing was meant to be feeling, and that he was expected to convey. Hamlet speaks of the player's conceit. Here you can see in the speech over here, he speaks of the player's conceit influencing his soul, all by means of a fiction, yes. Secondly, since felt emotions were thought to be contagious, by experiencing the passions he had evoked in himself, the actor was able to stimulate the feelings of the spectators. By experiencing the passions he had evoked in himself, the actor was able to stimulate the feelings of the spectators. To a modern theatre goer, this is, in today's world, it's very familiar with method acting that was formulated by Stanislavski. So if you read about Stanislavski's method of acting, you will find that he also is of the same opinion, and his theories were propounded about the early 20th century. He did not prompt his actors like in normally theatre যেটা হয়ে থাকে, prompts আসে যদি তুমি ভুলে যাও আর কি, there will be people in backstage who will prompt you your lines, the forgotten lines. Stanislavski his method did not include this. He wanted his actors to improvise, and for that his actors needed to be very well versed both emotively and verbally in the text or in the libretto that they are acting on. So this line also evokes acting theories both from the classical times and also in the modern times. Now if we resort to the antiquarians again, we see that Quintilian writes in his theory of oration, the person who will show the greatest power in expression of emotions will be the person who has properly formed what the Greeks called fantasy. We can call them visions. by which the images of absent things are presented to the mind in such a way that we seem actually to see them with our eyes and have them physically present to us. These visions, they create such a vivid impression in our minds that, as in a daydream, we succumb to the illusion that we are feeling the same emotions that we intend to evoke in others. As a result, our words will be intensely evocative and will produce a sense of energy or energia, a term that refers to a visually powerful description. Quintilian explicitly alludes to actors who are so moved by their performance that they leave the stage overwhelmed with tears. It is precisely this set of ideas that Hamlet gestures towards with the phrase, a dream of passion, which is a phrase that he uses in that speech. However, he does not break into a rhapsody. He does not break into an overwhelming, tearful, passionate reaction to the player's art. He goes on to imply that the player is a liar and says that what's Hecuba to him or he to her that he should weep for her. He demands. It is hard to overestimate the shock value of these lines. At one stroke, Hamlet calls the entire humanist rational into question. Humanist rational, that is all of these antiquarians of those thoughts that I have presented to you. Quintilian was an educationalist. And when his text of Institutio Oratorio was recovered, it actually fueled the humanist educational program throughout England. Literature and rhetoric were seen as twin arts, and school children were meant to undergo a rigorous regime in both of these fields. Both were regarded as means to move an audience to virtue by appealing to passions. By deriding the tradition of seeking to identify with dead or fictive classical figures in order to move one's audience, which Hamlet does, by doing this, Hamlet is denouncing the tenets of humanist thought. The tenets of humanist thought, which is founded upon lies, according to Hamlet. For the prince, there is a rigid divide between seeming and being, between actions that a man might play and that within which passes show. Also a line from the text. Like Plato, he disparages or he rejects illusions as derivative. Instead of borrowing emotions from cultural models, one should look into one's own heart to ascertain one's authentic feelings. The question Hamlet poses consists of two parts then. By asking what's Hecuba to him, he is implicitly questioning the basic premise of humanism, that the classics are a trove of wisdom, and that by imitating texts or figures of antiquity, whether historical or mythical, we learn to be ethical beings. Hamlet throws off these ideas from the table completely. By rigorously identifying with the emotions of a woman he has never met and who might never have existed, the actor, the player, Hamlet opines or insinuates, is faking it. The actor is faking. By asking what's he to her, Hamlet expands the scope of his reflections. He expands his reflective thought to ponder upon the wider relationship between fiction and emotional reality. What's Hecuba to him and what's he to her? These are very opposite ideas. She is a fictive character. She might not have been present at all in history. So when he says that what's he to her, Hamlet actually reconnects or establishes a connection between fiction and emotional reality. What part do imaginary archetypes play in shaping our feelings? Right? If an actor is moved by imagining a situation in his mind so much so that he has the power to influence the audience as well, then we can ask this question, that what part do imaginary archetypes play in shaping our feelings? How do we know when we are being authentic and when we are acting out other people's emotion? When do we know the difference? And what does this mean for our relations with our fellow beings? Hamlet's conflicted feelings reflect the struggle that was also raging in early modern culture about the ethical implications of theatre. And in a broader arc, in a broader perspective, the opposition between acting or feigning and sincerity. But more important than feeling emotions is the ability to display them. In stressing the importance of delivery, Cicero points out that reality always has the advantage over imitation. Yet, if reality by itself were sufficiently effective in delivery, we would have no need for any art at all. And he was right. If reality was sufficiently effective for delivery, we would have no need for art at all. Art would not need to exist. It is the priority of producing a persuasive performance that makes the rhetoricians avail themselves of mental images. But does this mean that the orator or the actor is stimulating or manipulating others to feel what he feels? Or has he been successful in his willed self-deception, willing suspension of disbelief that Coleridge talks about? That you suspend your own disbelief, to suspend your non-believing nature. So Quintilian says, I have certainly often been moved to the point of being overtaken not only by tears but by pallor and a grief which is very like the real thing. How does the speaker then understand whether what he is feeling is an authentic emotion or something that he has derived from the performances, which is merely a simulacrum of the real thing? More to the purpose for this essay, for this lesson, can we or can the audience tell the difference? And at the end of the soliloquy, Hamlet also voices similar distrust. For the ghost, he says, the spirit that I have seen may be a devil. He admits. To bring out the truth, the only solution Hamlet can think of is a recourse to the theatre. Like Plato, his suspicion of dramatic art is coupled with a strong belief in the power of illusions to sway the spectator. He himself attests to the effect of images, although perhaps not in a way that we might expect. Now let us try and connect all of this knowledge in the revenge tragedy tradition. So in the beginning I said that neither Hamlet nor other characters nor anybody was moved by the play as such. But what if that was not the case? Because Hamlet knows the entire speeches of the play of Mousetrap by heart, which he does orate within the text. And there is no need for him to talk about the play, the Mousetrap, when he is alone, because we have in Act 2 the famous soliloquy which begins with, "Oh, what a rogue and peasant slave am I." He's this speech which is held up as evidence for his inwardness, that he possesses an authentic self. We have studied it. But he proceeds to berate himself, to curse himself for his inaction. He calls himself a dull and muddy-metalled rascal, weak like a John of Dreams, if you remember the reading of the soliloquy. This self-abasement, it increases, it escalates steadily. He demands of himself whether he is a coward, and imagines an unknown opponent impugning or challenging his honor, only to conclude that he would be forced to accept the truth of allegation since he is pigeon-livered. The proof lies in the fact that he has not carried out the revenge imposed on him by his father. He even contemptuously compares himself to a whore whose only weapons are words. Ironically, to express his revulsion, his hatred at his lack of heroism, he too falls back on classical model. Emerus Jones has drawn attention to the comparisons, to the reverberations between Hamlet's second soliloquy and a speech in the Senecan drama Thyestes, in which the tyrant Atreus reproaches himself for his laziness, for his tardiness, at taking revenge on his brother for the latter's, that is, for the treachery that his brother has caused. Jasper Heywood translates the Senecan drama Thyestes, and this is the translation. You will find lots of similarities with Hamlet's evocation and the speech over here. The translation of Heywood, this is a Thomas Heywood's translation. Translation of Heywood makes Atreus, the hero, castigate himself, blame himself for unpacking his heart with words rather than taking action, very much like Hamlet. By now he goes on to claim in a hyperbolic rhetoric that he should have set the world ablaze with his revenge and made it resound with the clash of weapons. Not only does Hamlet's self-laceration echo these lines, the exorbitant language is also mirrored in a string of epithets that he uses to describe his uncle, such as the words blood, body, villain, remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless villain. And in his frenzied wish that he had cut the king to pieces and had fatted all the Rhegian kites with this slave's offal, these lines are very much in tune with Heywood's translation of the Senecan drama Thyestes. And it would have been, Heywood's translation would have been very familiar to the members of early modern audiences for their time as well. Full of bloodthirsty avengers, Hamlet's mind is full of bloodthirsty avengers. Whether it is the figure of the bestial, of the beastly Thyestes, or Pyrrhus, or the intermittently vengeful Aeneas which we spoke about, Hamlet has absorbed the entire gamut of emotions evoked by Senecan revenge tragedy and its early modern offshoots. And so his later lines also reveal similar notions. When he says, "'Tis now the very witching time of night, when churchyards yawn and hell itself breaks out contagion to this world. Now could I drink hot blood and do such business as the bitter day would quake to look on." He goes on to allude to Nero. The example of Nero and his vicious behavior towards his mother springs to his mind later on in this speech. Although he sets it aside as excessive, he himself sets it aside as excessive. Revenge plays reveled, enjoyed sensationalist violence and sadistic cruelty, as we are all aware. They are populated by protagonists caught in the manic circle of bloodlust and revenge, and they depict a harsh world in which the gods seem to be indifferent to the agony of the characters. Much of this scenario shapes Hamlet's own bleak vision. Perhaps the play suggests it is not the Aristotelian purgation or purification of passion or cathartic effect or ethical instruction that tragedy produces, but a far less healthy outcome. Perhaps Plato was right that role models in literature leach into us. They're like leeches, and the emotions inspired by fictitious characters or by fictions overpower our rational faculties. For all his the extent to which Nietzsche hated Socrates, Nietzsche hated all philosophers for the matter, for all his hatred and dislike for Socrates, Nietzsche was also akin to these thoughts. In a comment on Macbeth, in a book called The Dawn of the Day, Nietzsche points out that the influence of the theatre was anything but moral. Whoever believes that the sight of Macbeth on stage instigates us to shun or to quit evil of ambition have succumbed to the fatal illusion, Nietzsche claims in the book. Quite on the contrary, for the spectator who was enchanted, in a thrall rather, to ambition, Seeing his mirror image on the stage was a source of intense pleasure, and watching the protagonist brought to destruction through his passion only increased the taste of his attraction, of his pleasure. And heroes like Macbeth, Nietzsche argues, they give out demonic attraction. They emanate a sort of demonic attraction, and invite us to emulate them, invite us to follow them. Similarly, characters like Tristan and Isolde and other tragic characters, they exert their appeal not despite, but precisely because they are doomed. And their creators are in love with the passions, just as Shakespeare is. Far from providing warning against adultery, the lovers, that is Tristan and Isolde, if you read a quick summary of them, they were lovers actually, they were. Far from providing a warning against adultery, the lovers make it appear intensely glamorous. Tragic poets like Shakespeare and Sophocles urge us to take part in the adventure of life, and they entice us sort of with the allure of this exciting, dangerous, dark existence. They speak to us from a restless and vigorous age, half drunk and stupefied. Yes, I'm sorry for that. So they speak to us, as I was saying, as if from a restless and vigorous age, half drunk and stupefied by its excess of blood and energy, an age that is more evil than our own. Hamlet seems to have soaked up some of the dark thoughts disseminated by revenge tragedy, or to have persuaded himself that the role models it offered were what he should pattern himself on. To what extent he has been successful or he is successful, that is another question, and we have, I think, discussed upon his success as such. So what if then Hamlet was right, that the play within the play, that is the mouse trap, did give an added push to Claudius's conscience, inspiring him to confess his crime, precisely like what Thomas Heywood talks about in his Apology for Actors. In arguing for the function of reformation or reformatory function of tragedy that I just spoke about, Sidney writes that tragedy openeth the greatest wounds and showeth forth the ulcers that are covered with tissue, and maketh kings fear to be tyrants. Tragedy, Sidney claims, exposes hidden crimes and conduces and forces to self-knowledge, even on the part of tyrants. By way of illustration, Sidney provides an anecdote and writes how much it can move. Plutarch yielded a notable testimony of the abominable tyrant Alexander Pharos. So Sidney is alluding to Plutarch's Lives, Plutarch's work called Lives of Kings, and I've forgotten the entire name of the work. He alludes to Plutarch and alludes to a story narrated by Plutarch. The story goes that Alexander Pharos, from whose eyes a tragedy well made and represented drew abundance of tears. Tragedy drew tears from Alexander Pharos. He was a tyrant, and he too, without all pity, had murdered infinite numbers and some of his own blood. Yet he could not resist the sweet violence of tragedy. Sidney's story is taken from Plutarch's Life, as I said, of the Theban hero Pelopidas, where the tyrant Alexander of Pherae, whose hobbies included actually burying people alive and dressing them up in skins of bears so that they could be torn away at by hounds later on. And Sidney refers to Plutarch describing this particular tyrant who is melting into a flood of tears at a theatre performance of the Trojan Woman, that is written by Euripides. And then goes on to explain, what Alexander does. And and there are various versions of this particular story. But what emerges from all of these versions of the story is that Alexander enjoyed a good hearty cry over invented stories as much as any man. But he was anxious not to jeopardize his image as a pitiless strong man, because he used to cry secretly and not in front of others. All of the versions do hold this in common. So therefore we can actually conclude that even though he was moved to pity, he made sure that his self-image of a pitiless tyrant is not changed, is not altered to any extent. Whether in addition he drew pleasure from the weeping of fictive women is not recorded, although there are records of him being an art-loving person. But even Sidney is lacks when it comes to relating action and emotion, even from Alexander's example. For the end of knowledge was not simply increased understanding but right behavior. That is, your understanding of the relation between emotion and action and how they two find each other and influence each other and superimpose upon each other. Your understanding is not just enough. It has to translate into moral and ethical action that can be said to be the right way of living, right behavior. And Sidney also alludes to the Platonic maxim of knowing thyself, the Platonic dogma that is know thyself. Sidney repeats the fact that the end of well-doing and not well-knowing only is the purpose of knowledge. That is, knowledge serves the end of well-doing and not only well-knowing. Here he and in fact all humanist thinkers shared the same ground as that of Aristotle's. Because for Aristotle, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake was what is at stake. That is not enough. As he makes clear, the end of knowledge is action, that is the virtuous life. Sidney is forced to concede that the only consequence of Alexander's visit to the theatre was that the tyrant decided to withdraw from the performance, that is, come out of the stage. And unlike Claudius, however, he does not abort the event. He does not stop the entire play altogether. And even if the mousetrap has exactly the result that Hamlet wanted, and sets off a bout of guilt from the king, who turns to prayer to unburden his soul, Claudius is explicit that he has no intention of changing his life. Correct? He is torn by contradictory impulses, yes, to repent or not to repent. Both Platonic and Aristotelian thought shared the assumption that humans tend towards the good, and that if they acquired knowledge, they would choose the virtuous life. What we see, however, is how insight is only one of the forces acting on human beings, how knowledge is only one side of the forces that act upon us, and that conflicting desires shape our behavior. It is not just knowing that shapes, but there are conflicting desires, what we want, our experiences, that also shapes our knowledge, our behavior. There is, the play suggests, no intrinsic link between the instruction given out by drama and the way we live our lives. But how do these theories about how dramatic fictions influence us illuminate the theatrical situations that are presented in the play of Hamlet? In both the scenarios, if we see the player's speech, which is based on Aeneid, as I mentioned, and the mousetrap, the player's speech and the play that they enact within the text of Hamlet, we see a variety of reactions to the dramatic fictions on offer. Some characters are uncomprehending, some reject the play, some remain unmoved. Both Claudius and Hamlet are affected by the plays they witness, which start off virtuous thoughts in the king and violent emotions in the prince. It is by no means clear that it was the play within the play that first triggered Claudius's impulse of remorse. We are not given that information concretely, that it was the mousetrap, the play within the play, that actually pricked the conscience of the king as Hamlet had wanted. We do not have any clear instructions towards that. However, nor that it was the extract from player's speech that incited Hamlet's homicidal feelings. In both the cases, the emotions translated by the actors or the fictions, they do not, convert into action. In the world of Hamlet, the text, or in the world of Hamlet, the play, the notion that art serves a didactic function and persuades its audience to virtue simply does not hold. It does not hold. The play, within the world of Hamlet, art moving us to virtuous action, the theories that we studied till now, it does not hold. Artworks are charged with ambiguity, yes, and offer scope for a multitude of readings. Yes, again, as we do know that when we are reading Hamlet, and human reception of art is freighted with our own desires, as I just said. We see what we want to see. And this is exactly what the play of Hamlet also implies. We see what we want to see. We understand what we want to understand. From the ancients, discussion of spectatorship mixes with the discussion of acting. The term mimesis suggests both representation and imitation. In the Poetics, Aristotle admits that the truest distress or anger is conveyed by one who actually feels these things, and accordingly advises the actor to perfect his range of gestures to enlighten or to enkindle the appropriate emotions in himself. He needs to feel, he needs to perfect his gestures in order to have the appropriate emotions within himself. This raises the question when self-manipulation shades into feigning, into faking it. The distinction between the two remains very confusing, self-manipulation and faking. So this raises the question, as I said, of when self-manipulation confuses into or shades into faking it. This was, of course, a question which was very much pertinent in the early modern age, in that point of time, and Hamlet does not provide an answer. Instead, the text points out the difficulty of drawing, conclusions about the role of fiction in our lives. Ironically, as the second soliloquy of Hamlet shows, even Hamlet's most self-conscious lines cite other texts and draw on pervasive, literary paradigms. He gives multiple allusions. There is, it appears, no escape from fictions. For all his obsession with authenticity, in trying in a perusal, in an endless perusal to acquire authentic emotions and authentic action, Hamlet himself is the product of all of the plays and stories he has studied and imbibed within himself, within the culture in which he was born and bred. He is the embodiment of all the cultural myths circulating in his age, about the pity, the duty to revenge, the corruption of womanhood. Rough hew them how he will, which he says in his soliloquy. As Aristotle points out, mimesis is a part of human nature. We understand the world through images, and we are creatures of imitation. What then does the tragedy of Hamlet tell us about how tragedy works? What does it tell us? So Martha C. Nussbaum has adopted the Aristotelian model to offer a subtle and rich analysis of the emotional value of literary artworks. For Nussbaum too, emotions are suffused, they are amalgamated with intelligence, and crucial for ethical practice. While adopting the Aristotelian and Stoic view of emotion as value judgments by which we judge values, Nussbaum admits that the judgments in question might be good or bad guideposts to action. However, there is no way in which we can ignore them. We can choose one, but we cannot ignore any one of them. What she stresses is the role that the imagination plays in our emotion. A crucial source of ethical knowledge, she argues, is literature. She implicitly concedes or says that the catharsis model is too limited. Instead, she argues literature gives us a denser understanding of a range of emotions, and hence serves as a tool for self-knowledge. The reader, she says, or spectator of a literary work is reading or watching the work, but at the same time reading the world and reading herself. Like Aristotle, she believes that the pleasure we gain from suffering of others lie in acquiring understanding about the world. That is the most essential thing. She admits that some artworks cater to sadistic or voyeuristic pleasures, but in general, she argues literature creates forms of sympathy with fictive characters, a sympathy that spills over the pages of books or the theatre to embrace all of humanity. But what she misses in her concept of tragedy, however, is the idea that the knowledge that fictions offer might be knowledge about the dark sides of human nature. The problem is not only that art might fail to persuade to the good, it might persuade to evil, or at least convey the seductive allure that evil definitely has. Literature gives us access to the vast array of human life in all its diversity. Nietzsche's views about the dangerous power of imagination seem to be borne out by Shakespeare's tragic universe. Shakespeare's tragic universe bears this, this burden of the power of imagination. And in grappling with this similar question as to why we gain pleasure from the pain of others, A.D. Nuttall says that the suffering of tragic characters takes place in a fictive world, one under our control. Hence, tragedy caters to our desire for mastery, omnipotence, however limited. Furthermore, an artwork such as Shakespearean tragedy unsettles the assumption, which generally lies under normative cultural solutions. It gives us a form of resistance and offers us an insight into the shaky balance of all answers. Aristotle was right. We go to the theatre to learn about the world. We go to see Hamlet to watch how a confused, profoundly lonely young man reacts in an extreme situation. We kind of savor the aesthetic pleasure of a play that has become a rich storehouse of allusions and familiar phrases, and whose cultural cachet is shared by a global community. But Shakespeare achieved much more with Hamlet than simply creating a reservoir of cultural references. Sir Philip Sidney again writes in a defense of poesy, which has become famous less for its originality than for its wit and impression. The poet, he writes, doth grow in effect, another nature in making things either better than nature, bringeth forth, or quite anew, and adds, freely ranging only within the zodiac of his own wit. The poet is not necessarily, he means that the poet is not necessarily concerned with mirroring reality. Instead, he constructs a new reality. And that is what Hamlet's play within a play is all about, and Hamlet the text is also about.